The fluorescent lights of Ramstein air bases Seawing hummed their usual midnight drone, casting sterile white across freshly waxed floors. Major General Katarzyna, Iron Cat, Volkov moved through the corridor with the purposeful stride of someone who'd earned every star on her shoulder through blood, sweat, and 30 years of proving herself in a world that never stopped questioning whether she belonged. Her boots echoed against linoleum as she rounded the corner toward her office, already mentally cataloging the mountain of logistics reports waiting on her desk. Then she heard it, a voice, low and melodic, speaking what sounded like flawless Pashto. She slowed. The voice came from the conference room she'd just passed, its door slightly ajar. Through the gap she could see the back of a man in a gray maintenance uniform, headphones over his ears, pushing a cleaning cart. He was speaking to himself, or perhaps to an audiobook, his cadence natural and unforced. As she watched, he switched seamlessly into Dari, then Arabic, then something that took her a moment to place, Urdu. The general stood frozen. In her 3 decades of military service across 4 continents, she'd met perhaps a dozen people who could genuinely operate in more than 3 languages. This janitor, this man whose name she'd probably seen on a roster somewhere and immediately forgotten, was cycling through regional dialects like he was changing radio stations. She checked her watch. 2:47 hours. Her intelligence briefing wasn't until 600. Volkov had built her career on reading situations others missed, on recognizing assets where others saw only furniture. She'd been the underestimated one once, the farm girl from Montana who spoke with an accent her academy classmates mocked, who had to be twice as sharp to get half the credit. She'd flown combat sorties over Kandahar when people still questioned whether women could handle the pressure. She'd lost friends, gained scars, and learned that the most dangerous thing in warfare wasn't the enemy you could see, it was the asset you overlooked. The janitor switched to what sounded like Somali, his pronunciation suggesting native-level fluency. Then French. Not the classroom French of officers trying to impress NATO colleagues, but the rapid, colloquial French of someone who'd lived it. Volkov's mind was already moving through possibilities, scenarios, questions. This base processed intelligence from 18 different regions. They had translators, sure, but they were overworked, often delayed, sometimes compromised by their own biases or limited by security clearances that took months to obtain. And here was someone who apparently could navigate half the linguistic landscape of modern conflict zones, pushing a mop at nearly 3 in the morning. She stepped forward and knocked gently on the doorframe. The man startled, yanking off his headphones. He turned, and Volkov found herself looking at a face that told its own story, maybe late 30s, weathered in a way that spoke of more than just hard work, with eyes that held the particular alertness of someone who'd learned to stay aware of their surroundings. There was a faded name tag on his uniform, KASPER-M. He moved to stand at something resembling attention, but it was all wrong, too relaxed, too informal. Civilian hire then. Ma'am, he said simply, his English carrying the faintest trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. European, maybe. Sorry if I was too loud, I'll move to another section. His hand moved toward his cleaning cart, but Volkov raised one finger. What was that? She asked. The languages, how many do you speak? Casper froze. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, calculation, maybe, or wariness. The look of someone who'd learned that standing out wasn't always safe. I just study in my free time, ma'am, helps pass the hours. That wasn't study, Volkov said flatly. That was fluency, multiple fluencies. I'm asking you a direct question, Mr. Casper. How many languages do you speak? The janitor set down the mop handle slowly. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, not quite resignation, not quite relief. 9, ma'am, conversationally. Maybe 6 at full operational capacity. Operational capacity. The phrasing wasn't accidental. Volkov's instincts, honed by 3 decades of reading people under pressure, started connecting dots she hadn't known were there. And you're working night maintenance at a military installation because... Casper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Because it has good benefits, stable hours, and my daughter needs stability more than I need a resume that impresses people. There it was, the edge in his voice, the first crack in the careful neutrality. Volkov had heard that tone before in the voices of soldiers who'd seen action and came home to find that their service meant less than the college degrees they'd skipped to enlist. But this felt different, more complex. "Your daughter," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am, Emma. She's 7. Speech therapy 3 times a week, occupational therapy twice. The base medical coverage is excellent." The general processed this, her tactical mind already running scenarios. "Where did you learn Pashto?" Another flicker in his eyes. "Afghanistan. I was civilian contractor, translator support for SF units, embedded teams." Volkov's estimation of the man shifted dramatically. Civilian translators who embedded with special forces didn't last long unless they were exceptional. The turnover was brutal, either from danger, from stress, or from failing to meet the impossible standards of operators who depended on split-second linguistic precision to stay alive. "Which teams?" she asked. Casper hesitated. "I'm not sure what I'm cleared to. Captain Reeves's unit, Task Force Viking, 2011 through 2014. She said it as statement, not question, watching his face. His expression confirmed it before his words did. "You know Captain Reeves." "Colonel Reeves now," Volkov corrected. "And yes, he mentioned once that his best interpreter got out of the game after a close call in Helmand. Said the man had a kid back home and decided fatherhood was more important than dodging RPGs. That was you." Casper nodded slowly. "IED hit our convoy. I walked away. Barely. Emma was 4 and her mother had just. It was just the 2 of us. I couldn't risk her losing both parents." The weight of it sat heavy in the air between them. The unspoken calculation every parent in a war zone makes. The arithmetic of love versus duty versus survival. Volkov understood it better than most. She'd never had children, but she'd written letters to their parents, and those letters had taught her the currency of sacrifice in ways that combat never had. "Why languages?" she asked, her tone softer now. "Why not computers or engineering or something that translates better to civilian credentials?" For the first time, something like a smile touched Casper's face. "My grandmother was Polish, grandfather was Turkish. I grew up in Berlin with an Italian stepfather. By the time I was 12, mixing languages felt more natural than sticking to one. In Afghanistan, he paused, choosing words carefully. "It felt like using a skill that actually mattered. Like I was helping people communicate instead of just fixing their plumbing." Volkov recognized the undertone. He was listing plumbing as beneath him, which meant he'd probably tried a dozen different jobs since coming home, each one failing to fill the gap that adrenaline and purpose had left behind. She'd seen it 100 times, people who'd tasted the sharp edge of meaningful work and found everything else flavorless by comparison. "You're underemployed," she said bluntly. Casper's laugh was short and humorless. "I'm a single father with a special needs kid and gaps in my work history that I can't explain without security clearances I no longer have. I'm employed exactly as much as I can be, ma'am. Colonel Reeves would vouch for you. Colonel Reeves has his own career to protect. I've got a GED and contractor experience that technically doesn't exist on any official record. You know how it works." He wasn't wrong. The military loved its contractors when they were useful and forgot them the moment they became inconvenient. Volkov had fought that system her entire career, but even she couldn't change it single-handedly. Still standing here in a half-lit conference room at nearly 3 in the morning, looking at a man who could do what maybe 5 dozen people in the entire European theater could do, she felt the old tactical instinct firing. "What if I could change your clearance status?" she asked. Casper went very still. "Ma'am, I'm serious. What if I could get you a position that uses your actual skills, keeps you on base so you're near your daughter, pays 3 times what you're making now, and comes with the kind of job satisfaction that makes waking up worthwhile?" The janitor stared at her like she just offered him a winning lottery ticket. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've spent 30 years watching the military waste resources while complaining it doesn't have enough resources," Volkov said. "Because I've got an intelligence division drowning in translated intercepts they can't process fast enough. Because I was once the person everyone underestimated, and I learned to trust my instincts about people. She paused, then added more quietly, and because Colonel Reeves told me his interpreter saved his life twice, once from an ambush they avoided because you heard something in a local's tone that nobody else caught, and once from a negotiation that would have gone sideways if you hadn't understood the tribal dynamics in play. He said you were worth 10 conventional translators. So I'm asking you, Mr. Casper, are you interested in actually using your brain again, or are you content pushing a mop? Casper looked down at his hands, rough, calloused hands that had probably held weapons and radios and the thin threads of life-or-death conversations. When he looked back up, there was something raw in his expression. My daughter comes first. Always, I need flexibility for her appointments. I need to be able to leave if there's an emergency. I need. Understood, Volkov cut in. We'll make it work. I don't need a hero, Mr. Casper. I need a translator who won't fold under pressure and who can tell me when something sounds wrong. Can you do that? The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Casper straightened, not quite to attention but closer than before. Yes, ma'am, I can do that. Good. Be at my office at 800. Bring your daughter's medical documentation and your contractor's service records, whatever you have. We'll start the clearance reinstatement process and get you briefed on current ops. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, that 8th language you cycled through earlier, the one after French. What was it? Casper's smile was genuine this time, though tinged with something like relief. Hungarian, ma'am. My daughter's mother was from Budapest. I promised I'd teach Emma her mother's language when she's old enough to ask about her. Volkov nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then she walked out, leaving Casper standing alone in the conference room, still holding his mop, staring at the space where his life had just pivoted on an axis he hadn't seen coming. The general moved through the corridors with new purpose, already drafting the personnel requisition in her head. She'd learned long ago that wars were won by people, not just by weapons, and the right person in the right position could shift outcomes in ways that entire battalions couldn't. Tomorrow, she'd begin the bureaucratic battle to extract Maxim Casper from the invisible margins of military infrastructure and place him where he belonged. Tonight, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Somewhere in the distance, a transport plane's engines roared to life, beginning another mission into the dark. The base hummed with its endless rhythm of preparation and execution, thousands of people moving through their roles, most of them never quite fitting, never quite feeling seen. But sometimes, Volkov thought, sometimes you found the ones who'd been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to actually look. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message to Colonel Reeves. Found your translator. You were right, he's exactly what we need, KV. The response came back within minutes. Took you long enough. Fair warning, he's stubborn as hell and won't suffer fools. You'll either love him or want to court-martial him within a week. Also, his kid is amazing. Treat them both right. J.R. Volkov smiled at her phone screen, stubborn and unwilling to suffer fools. In other words, exactly like every operator she'd ever respected. She could work with that. As she finally reached her office, the mountain of logistics reports waiting exactly where she'd left them, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation for tomorrow's work, the sense that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that would matter. The next morning arrived with the particular crispness of early autumn in Germany, the kind of weather that made everything feel sharper, more immediate. Volkov had been at her desk since 5:30, working through the preliminary paperwork for Casper's clearance reinstatement and preparing her case for why a night janitor needed immediate access to classified intelligence operations. At precisely 800, her adjutant buzzed. "General, Mr. Casper is here, and he's brought his daughter." Volkov paused mid-signature. She hadn't explicitly said to bring the child, but she hadn't said not to either, and the fact that he'd interpreted her request for medical documentation as implicit permission showed the kind of practical thinking that served well in ambiguous situations. Send them in. The door opened, and Casper entered looking markedly different than he had at 300. He changed from his maintenance uniform into civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a button-down shirt that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. More striking was the little girl holding his hand. Emma Casper was small for 7, with dark curly hair pulled back in a slightly lopsided ponytail and enormous brown eyes that tracked every detail of the room with startling intensity. She wore a purple backpack decorated with cartoon planets and clutched a well-loved stuffed rabbit under one arm. The child didn't speak, but she watched Volkov with the kind of evaluative stare that suggested she understood far more than people probably gave her credit for. "Mr. Casper," Volkov said, standing and moving around her desk. She made eye contact with the child. "And you must be Emma. Thank you both for coming." Casper looked slightly uncomfortable. "I couldn't find childcare on short notice. Her therapy isn't until 1,000, so I thought, if this is inappropriate, I can." "It's fine," Volkov interrupted. She addressed Emma directly. "Would you like to draw while your father and I talk? I have paper and markers in that drawer." She pointed to a cabinet near the window. Emma looked up at her father, who nodded. The girl moved with careful precision to the cabinet, extracted paper and markers with methodical attention to organization, and settled herself on the floor near the window where she could watch the airfield. Within seconds, she was absorbed in creating something with intense concentration. "She's very focused," Volkov observed quietly. Casper's expression softened as he watched his daughter. "She's brilliant. The speech delay makes people think she's not keeping up, but her cognitive processing is off the charts. She understands everything. She just needs more time to respond verbally." "Underestimated because of something that has nothing to do with her actual capability," Volkov said. "I'm familiar with the concept." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, the recognition of kindred experience, of knowing what it meant to be perpetually misjudged. Casper set a worn folder on the desk. "Everything I have. Contractor agreements, security clearance documentation from 2011, Emma's medical records, therapy schedules, and 3 reference letters from officers I worked with. Colonel Reeves sent one over this morning after you apparently messaged him." "I did," Volkov confirmed, opening the folder. As she scanned the documents, a picture emerged that was even more impressive than she'd anticipated. Casper had operated with multiple Special Forces teams across Afghanistan, earning commendations from 4 different unit commanders. His language assessments showed native-level proficiency in 6 languages and professional working proficiency in 3 more. There were incident reports where his translations had directly prevented civilian casualties, had uncovered insurgent networks, had de-escalated situations that could have turned into firefights. Then came the gap 2014 forward, nothing but sporadic employment history, construction work, warehouse loading, security guard positions that lasted a few months before family obligations forced him to quit. Each job a step down from the last, each one further from the skills that actually defined him. The medical records told Emma's story: developmental delays, sensory processing disorder, mild autism spectrum diagnosis, weekly therapy appointments, specialist consultations, educational support documentation. The kind of intensive care that required both money and time, the kind of commitment that made stable employment nearly impossible for a single parent. "You've been doing this alone," Volkov said. It wasn't a question. Her mother passed when Emma was 5, complications from an illness nobody caught until it was too late. Casper's voice was level, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. "It's been just us since then." Volkov closed the folder carefully. "Here's what I'm offering. Translator position, GS-11 pay scale to start with potential for higher once your clearance is fully reinstated. You'll work with the intelligence division processing intercepts, translating field communications, and potentially consulting on cultural context for operations." She paused, making sure he was following. "Hours are flexible. You'll have an office in C-Wing, and when Emma's school schedule requires it, she can be in the base childcare facility that handles military dependents. It's excellent. Speech therapist on staff, occupational therapy resources, the works. Your security clearance reinstatement will take approximately 6 weeks, but I'm invoking emergency provisional authority to bring you on immediately. You'll have supervised access to materials until the full clearance comes through. Casper stared at her like she just recited impossibilities. General, I don't. That's not just a job, that's a complete life change. Why? Because this base processes approximately 2,000 intercepted communications per week, Volkov said bluntly. We have 8 translators covering 14 languages. The backlog is dangerous. We're missing connections, losing context, failing to identify threats because we don't have enough eyes on the material. You represent the equivalent of hearing 3 specialists at once. She leaned forward slightly. But more than that, Mr. Casper, I believe in putting people where they can do the most good. You've been surviving. I'm offering you a chance to do meaningful work again while actually taking care of your daughter properly. If you have a better option, tell me now. The silence stretched. Across the room, Emma was drawing what appeared to be an extremely detailed airplane, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Casper looked at his daughter, then back at Volkov. What's the catch? The work is classified. You can't discuss it. Some days will be hard, you'll translate things that are difficult to hear. The intel community can be territorial, and you'll face skepticism from people who think a civilian contractor doesn't belong in their space. Volkov's expression hardened slightly. And you'll be working for me, which means I'll expect excellence. I don't accept excuses, I don't tolerate laziness, and I don't have patience for people who waste my time. But if you bring your best work, I'll fight for you and your daughter like you're my own. Casper absorbed this, weighing invisible factors. Finally, he extended his hand. When do I start? Volkov shook his hand firmly. Tomorrow, 700. Today you're getting Emma to therapy and arranging your life. Tomorrow you join the war effort properly. As they stood, Emma looked up from her drawing and walked over carefully. She held up the paper, not to Volkov, but to her father. Zvezda, she said softly. It was the first word she'd spoken since entering the office. The pronunciation was nearly perfect. Casper's face transformed with pride. That's right, Emma, it's a star. He looked at Volkov. We've been practicing Russian at night. She's picking it up faster than I did. Volkov felt something catch in her chest, not quite emotion, but close. A 7-year-old with speech delays learning her 10th language through bedtime practice with her father. Emma, she said gently, crouching down to be at eye level with the child, that's beautiful. Would you like to learn more words? Emma nodded solemnly, then looked at her father for confirmation. When Casper smiled, she whispered Samoliot, airplane. She'd drawn an airplane and labeled it in Russian. Volkov straightened, meeting Casper's eyes. Your daughter is learning languages from you. It helps her process, Casper explained. The repetition, the structure, it works with how her brain operates. By the time she's 10, she'll probably speak more languages than I do. The general nodded slowly, already recalculating. Mr. Casper, I'm going to need you to document your teaching methods. We have military kids on base struggling with language acquisition for overseas postings. If your approach works, it could help a lot of families. She paused, then added, and Emma, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there are people here who would love to learn from you too. The little girl processed this seriously, then nodded once before returning to her paper and markers, already starting another drawing. As Casper gathered their belongings to leave, Volkov added quietly, you're teaching her that being different doesn't mean being less. That's worth more than any translation. Casper's smile was tired but genuine. Someone needs to. The world won't teach her that naturally. No, Volkov agreed. It won't. But maybe we can build a small corner of the world where it's true anyway. After they left, she stood at her window watching the airfield, thinking about underestimated people and second chances and the strange mathematics of war, where 9 languages learned in grief and necessity might save lives in ways that billion-dollar weapons systems never could. Her phone buzzed. Colonel Reeves again. Heard you met Emma. Told you she was something special. That kid is going to change the world. Make sure her father gets the chance to help her do it. Jr. Volkov typed back, already done, and Reeves, you were right, about all of it. KV. She returned to her desk and began the next phase of paperwork, already anticipating the resistance she'd face from administrative officers who wouldn't understand why a janitor needed immediate classified access. But she'd fought bigger battles against longer odds, and she'd learned long ago that the most important victories weren't the ones that made headlines. They were the ones that gave people the chance to become who they were always meant to be. Somewhere below, on the airfield, a maintenance crew prepped a C-130 for its next mission. The base hummed its perpetual rhythm, thousands of moving parts synchronized in the complex machinery of military operations. And in a few hours, a single father would take his daughter to speech therapy, then go home and rearrange his entire life around a future he'd stopped believing was possible. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Maxim Casper would go to bed knowing that someone had actually seen him, not the maintenance uniform or the gaps in his resume, but the person underneath, the skills that mattered, the potential that bureaucracy had buried. And that, Volkov reflected as she signed her name across the provisional security authorization, was exactly the kind of tactical advantage that won wars, putting the right people in the right places and giving them the chance to do what they did best. The rest would sort itself out. It always did. Maxim Casper arrived at Ramstein's Sea-Wing Intelligence Section at 6:45 the next morning, 15 minutes early, wearing the same pressed shirt, and carrying a worn leather bag that looked like it had survived Afghanistan alongside him. Emma was already dropped at the base childcare facility, where she'd reportedly spent her first 10 minutes organizing the toy bins by color and size while the staff watched in fascination. Captain Jennifer Okonkwo, chief of the Intelligence Division's language section, met Casper at the secure entrance with the expression of someone who'd been overruled and wasn't happy about it. She was mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the rigid posture of someone who'd climbed the officer ranks by being better than everyone else and knew it. "You're the civilian," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am," Casper replied, defaulting to the military courtesy that had been beaten into him by years of embedded service. "The general says you speak 9 languages." Her tone suggested deep skepticism. "Yes, ma'am. We'll see." Okonkwo's smile was thin and professional. "The translators in my section are all military trained with advanced degrees in linguistics. They've been through DLI and hold top-secret clearances. You're here on provisional authority, which means you'll be supervised, your work will be double-checked, and you'll stay in your lane. Clear." "Clear, ma'am," Casper said evenly, though something in his eyes suggested he'd heard variations of this speech before. Volkov had anticipated this. She'd called Okonkwo the previous evening and delivered a clear message. Give Casper a fair shot or explain to a 2-star general why the intelligence division was too proud to use available resources. But anticipating resistance and eliminating it were different things, and Okonkwo was clearly going to make him prove himself. The captain led him through corridors that smelled of recycled air and strong coffee, past offices where young officers stared at monitors filled with intercepts, transcripts, and intelligence reports. The space had the particular tension of a place where information moved fast and mistakes carried consequences measured in lives. "Your workspace," Okonkwo said, gesturing to a desk in a corner near the main operations floor. It was smaller than the others, with an older computer and a view of exactly nothing. The message was clear: "You're here, but you're not one of us." Casper set down his bag without comment. "What do you need me to work on?" Okonkwo handed him a folder marked with classification stamps. "Pashto intercept from last week. 3 of my translators have taken a crack at it. They all came up with slightly different interpretations of a key phrase. You're the tiebreaker." She was testing him. Casper knew it, and she knew he knew it. This wasn't about actually needing help. This was about seeing if the janitor could perform at the level the general claimed. He opened the folder and scanned the transcript. The intercept was from a radio communication in Kandahar province, 2 speakers discussing what appeared to be a supply route. The contentious phrase was rendered 3 ways in the existing translations, each subtly different, each potentially leading to different intelligence conclusions. Casper read through it twice, then closed his eyes and listened to the audio file on the computer, playing it back 3 times. When he opened his eyes, Okonkwo was watching him with the intensity of a sniper judging windage. "They're all wrong," Casper said quietly, Explain. The phrase isn't about supply routes, it's about water management. The translator heard Razida and assumed supplies, but in this dialect, in this context, they're discussing irrigation channels. The second speaker is from Helmand, different regional pronunciation. What sounds like route coordination is actually arguing about agricultural water access. He pointed to a specific timestamp. Here, this word they translated as vehicles is actually buffalo. They're not moving materiel. They're arguing about livestock access to water during drought season. Okonkwo's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. She took the folder back. Wait here. She disappeared into an office, and Casper could hear the low murmur of phone conversation. 10 minutes later, she returned with Colonel Reeves trailing behind her. Reeves was lean and weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent more time in the field than behind desks. When he saw Casper, his face split into a genuine grin. There he is, the son of a bitch who saved my life twice. Casper stood, muscle memory pulling him into something resembling attention. Colonel, good to see you, sir. Cut that sir shit, Reeves said, pulling him into a brief, hard hug. We bled together, you call me Jim or I'll have you cleaning latrines. He turned to Okonkwo. Captain, this man kept my entire team alive for 3 years. When everyone else was translating literally, he was telling us what people actually meant. You know how many times that matters. Okonkwo's professional mask cracked slightly. He just caught an error that 3 DLI graduates missed. That's because DLI teaches languages, Reeves said. Casper lives them, there's a difference. He looked at Casper. General Volkov told me she recruited you. About damn time someone pulled their head out of their ass. The colonel's endorsement shifted something in the room's atmosphere. Okonkwo's skepticism didn't vanish, but it recalibrated into something more like cautious respect. If you're vouching for him, Colonel, then we'll adjust expectations. I'm vouching for him, Reeves confirmed. And I'm telling you, Captain, give this man the hard stuff. The intercepts where context matters more than vocabulary. The ones where you need someone who understands tribal dynamics and regional history and the 1,000 tiny cultural signals that separate accurate intelligence from disaster. He clapped Casper on the shoulder. Welcome back to the war, brother. Try not to make the rest of us look bad. After Reeves left, Okonkwo studied Casper with renewed assessment. All right, new test. We've got a backlog of 50 Dari intercepts from Kabul, mostly involving what we think are Taliban affiliates discussing operations. But something feels off about them and nobody can pin down what. You've got until end of day. Tell me what we're missing. It was the kind of assignment that could take days, but Casper just nodded. I'll need uninterrupted access and decent headphones. You'll have both. Okonkwo's tone had shifted from dismissive to professionally neutral. Don't make me regret this. Casper settled into his corner workspace and began the deep dive into intercepts, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of linguistic puzzle solving. The Dari speakers were educated, urban, using formal grammar that suggested government or business backgrounds. But there were odd phrases, idiomatic expressions that didn't quite fit Taliban communication patterns. By 1400 hours, he'd identified the discrepancy. These weren't Taliban operatives. They were Afghan government officials discussing anti-corruption investigations, using coded language that resembled insurgent communication, but with subtle markers that revealed bureaucratic rather than militant context. The implications were significant. Intelligence resources were being misdirected, potentially missing real threats while chasing government internal politics. When he presented his findings to Okonkwo at 1630 hours, she listened in silence, then immediately pulled in 2 other analysts. They spent an hour challenging his interpretation, testing his reasoning, pushing back on conclusions. Casper held his ground, walking them through the linguistic evidence, the cultural context, the patterns he'd learned from years of actually living in the regions these speakers came from. Finally, Okonkwo leaned back in her chair. You just saved us from recommending an operation that would have compromised a friendly government's internal investigation. She paused, choosing words carefully, that's exactly the kind of analysis we need. She extended her hand. Welcome to the team, Casper, for real this time. As he left the building that evening to collect Emma from childcare, Maxim felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The bone-deep satisfaction of doing work that mattered, of using skills he'd feared, were rusting away into irrelevance. Emma ran to him the moment he entered the childcare facility, her face lit with excitement. She'd apparently spent the day teaching 3 other children how to count to 10 in Polish, using a system of hand gestures she'd invented herself. The staff were equal parts exhausted and impressed. "Your daughter is remarkable," the facility director told him. "She's already helping our speech therapist develop new techniques. We'd love to have her here regularly." On the drive home, Emma chattered more than usual, her words coming slower than other kids but filled with genuine enthusiasm about her day, about new friends, about the airplanes she'd watched from the window. Casper listened, his heart full in a way he'd forgotten was possible. That night after Emma was asleep, he sat on their apartment's small balcony and looked up at the stars over Germany. Somewhere out there, communications were being intercepted, intelligence was being processed, operations were being planned. And tomorrow he'd be part of that again, not as an afterthought or a contractor whose name appeared on no official rosters, but as someone whose skills were recognized, whose work mattered, whose expertise was valued. He thought about General Volkov, about her instinct to look past uniforms and titles to see actual capability. He thought about Colonel Reeves, who'd never forgotten him even after years apart. He thought about Captain Okonkwo, whose skepticism had transformed into professional respect once he'd proven himself. But mostly, he thought about Emma, asleep in her room with her stuffed rabbit, dreaming whatever 7-year-olds dream. She'd never have to wonder if her father was doing something important. She'd grow up knowing that being different wasn't a weakness, that unconventional paths could still lead somewhere meaningful, that the world sometimes, just sometimes, made space for people who didn't fit the expected patterns. Tomorrow would bring new intercepts, new puzzles, new opportunities to translate not just words but context and culture, and the subtle frequencies of human communication that could mean the difference between peace and violence. But tonight, Maxim Casper simply sat beneath foreign stars and allowed himself to feel something he'd thought was lost forever, hope for a future that made sense. Within 2 weeks, Casper had become indispensable. The intelligence division's backlog began to clear as he processed intercepts with a speed and accuracy that made the junior analysts look like first-year students. But more valuable than his speed was his instinct, the ability to sense when something was culturally wrong, when a phrase didn't match a speaker's background, when the subtext contradicted the text. He caught 3 more misdirected intelligence assessments, identified 2 previously unknown informants based on dialect analysis, and flagged a communication pattern that suggested an emerging threat network in North Africa. Okonkwo, to her credit, recognized talent when it was undeniable and shifted from skeptic to advocate. She began routing the most complex intercepts directly to Casper, the ones where linguistic ambiguity could mean life or death for operators in the field. The rest of the team noticed and adjusted accordingly. Military personnel had an informal but rigid hierarchy, and civilians usually occupied its lowest tier. But Casper's battlefield credentials and Colonel Reeves's vocal endorsement carried weight. More importantly, he didn't play political games or seek attention. He just did the work, went home to his daughter, and came back the next day ready to do more. By the 3rd week, junior officers were asking him questions. By the 4th, senior analysts were inviting him into planning sessions. And by the 6th week, when his full security clearance was reinstated with a priority flag from General Volkov's office, he'd become what he'd always been meant to be, the linguistic bridge between cultures at war. But success created its own pressures. The intelligence community's appetite for his skills was voracious, and the requests multiplied. Could he review this Somali intercept? Could he consult on this Iranian diplomatic communication? Could he help interpret this Urdu social media analysis? The work was meaningful, but it was also endless, and Casper found himself staying later, coming in earlier, trying to keep up with demands that exceeded what one person could reasonably handle. Emma noticed. She didn't have the words to articulate it directly, but her drawings started featuring empty chairs and clocks, and she began asking when they could practice Russian together, their evening ritual that had been sacrificed to mounting work obligations. The breaking point came 5 weeks into his new position. Casper was deep in an intercept analysis at 2100 hours, having stayed late to finish a priority translation for an operation scheduled for the next morning. His phone buzzed, the childcare facility emergency line. Emma had become dysregulated, the staff reported, inconsolable and unable to communicate what was wrong. He needed to come immediately. Casper abandoned his desk mid-analysis and drove to the facility with his heart in his throat. He found Emma curled in a quiet corner, rocking slightly, her stuffed rabbit clutched so tight her knuckles were white. The moment she saw him, she burst into tears, not the tantrum crying of a typical 7-year-old, but the deep, hiccuping sobs of someone who'd been holding terror at bay through sheer will. "Papa," she managed, the word breaking into pieces. Thought you weren't coming." He gathered her into his arms, feeling her shake against his chest. "I'm here, Zvezda, I'm always here, always." The facility director explained quietly. Emma had asked about him repeatedly, and when the staff couldn't give her a specific pickup time, she'd spiraled into anxiety. For a child who needed structure and predictability, the uncertainty had been overwhelming. Casper carried his daughter to the car, her face buried against his shoulder, and drove home in silence punctuated only by her occasional shuddering breaths. He'd failed her. Not dramatically, not through neglect, but through the slow erosion of presence that ambition and obligation could create. That night he sat with Emma until she fell asleep, then remained in her doorway for another hour watching her breathe, recalibrating everything. The work mattered, but she mattered more. Always. The next morning he arrived at Volkov's office without an appointment. Her adjutant tried to stop him, but the general heard the commotion and waved him in. "Mr. Casper, you look like you didn't sleep. I need to talk about boundaries, ma'am." He stood at something resembling attention, jaw tight. "I'm grateful for this opportunity. The work is important, but I stayed late last night and my daughter had a crisis because I wasn't there when she expected me. That can't happen again." Volkov set down her pen with careful deliberation. "Sit down." He sat, hands clasped, waiting for the reprimand. Instead, the general leaned forward with an expression that was unusually unguarded. "Mr. Casper, I'm going to tell you something I don't share often. When I was a captain, I lost a friend, a fellow pilot named Marcus Washington. Good man, brilliant officer, so dedicated to the mission that he missed his son's 8th birthday to prep for a training exercise. 3 weeks later, Marcus died when his helicopter went down over Nevada. His son grew up remembering that his father chose work over showing up." She paused, letting that sink in. "I've spent 30 years thinking about that choice and what it means. The work we do is important. Sometimes it's life and death. But if we sacrifice everything else for it, we become ghosts in our own lives, haunting the spaces where we should be present." "So here's what we're going to do," Volkov continued. "You're going to set firm hours. You work 700 to 1600, period. No exceptions unless there's a genuine, immediate crisis, and I will personally decide what qualifies. Captain Okonkwo will distribute your workload among the team and will hire another translator to share the burden." "Ma'am, I can handle." "It's not about handling it," she interrupted. "It's about building sustainable operations. You're valuable because you're excellent at what you do. You'll stop being excellent if you burn out or if your family life collapses. I won't allow either." Casper felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me, thank Emma. She reminded both of us what matters." Volkov's smile was brief but genuine. "Now get to work. You've got 7 hours to be brilliant, and then you're going home to teach your daughter Russian." The boundary helped, but the real transformation came 2 weeks later during a crisis that would redefine how the entire base understood Maxim Casper. An intercept came through from an asset in Syria, a local informant reporting on an imminent attack against a humanitarian convoy. The communication was in Arabic mixed with Kurdish dialect, dense with regional references and coded language. The base's senior Arabic translator was on emergency leave, and the junior translator assigned to the intercept was drowning, unable to parse the layers of meaning fast enough to provide actionable intelligence. The convoy was scheduled to depart in 6 hours. Okonkwo brought the intercept to Casper at 8:30 hours. I know you don't usually work Kurdish, but we're out of options. Can you even attempt this? He scanned the transcript, listened to the audio twice. His Arabic was strong, his Kurdish functional but not fluent. The dialect was rural, agricultural, mixing in Turkish loanwords and references to tribal dynamics he only partially understood. It was exactly the kind of intercept that needed a native speaker with regional expertise. I can't translate this accurately alone, he said flatly. The convoy will move or it won't based on our assessment. If I guess wrong about context, people die. Okonkwo's frustration was visible. So what do we do? Casper thought fast, running through resources. There's a Kurdish contractor on base, works in food services. Sergeant Michaels mentioned him last week. Refugee background, came over in 2016. If we can find him and he's willing to consult, between us we might get this right. We don't have time for vetting. Then don't vet him. Listen to our combined analysis and decide if it makes sense. You're the intelligence officer. I'm just giving you better input to work with. 20 minutes later, Casper sat in a secure conference room with Dilshed Ahmed, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd been preparing lunch in the base commissary an hour earlier and now looked utterly bewildered to be discussing Kurdish dialect with military intelligence. I'm not a translator, Ahmed kept insisting. I just cook food. You speak Kurdish, Casper said patiently. From Erbil, yes. Rural dialect. Yes, but then you're exactly who we need. Listen to this and tell me what you hear. Not what the words mean, but what the speaker is actually saying. They worked through the intercept together, Casper handling the Arabic framework while Ahmed provided cultural context, regional knowledge, and the 1,000 subtle markers that separated literal translation from actual meaning. The informant wasn't describing an attack. He was warning that local militias believed the convoy was providing aid to rival tribes, and they were planning to block the route and confiscate supplies, potentially with violence if resisted. It wasn't a military operation. It was a tribal grievance about resource distribution during drought conditions, exactly like the water dispute Casper had identified in his first week. The context completely changed the appropriate response. Okonkwo listened to their joint analysis, asked sharp questions, then immediately contacted the convoy command and recommended a different route and a different approach, one that involved tribal mediation rather than military escort. The convoy adjusted its plan. No shots were fired. Aid reached its destination. And Dilshed Ahmed, who'd spent 9 years in America believing his language skills had no value beyond helping other refugees navigate grocery stores, found himself with a provisional consultant contract and the knowledge that his cultural expertise had prevented violence. Casper watched it happen with a sense of déjà vu, another underestimated person pulled from obscurity because someone finally asked the right questions. When Ahmed left the conference room looking dazed and clutching his consultant paperwork, Casper turned to Okonkwo. There are probably a dozen people on this base with language skills we're not using. Food service, maintenance, administrative support, refugees, immigrants, military dependents. We're sitting on a resource we don't even see. Okonkwo studied him thoughtfully. You want to build a database. I want to build a network. Informal, flexible, people we can consult when we need specific expertise. Not employees, just assets who get compensated for their knowledge when we need it. That's not standard protocol. Neither was hiring a janitor to do intelligence work, Casper pointed out. But General Volkov understood that value doesn't always come in standard packages. Okonkwo smiled slightly. I'll take it to the general, but if this happens, it's your project. You find them, you vet them, you coordinate. Consider it additional duty. Yes, ma'am, Casper agreed, already mentally cataloging conversations he'd had with base personnel over the past weeks, nodding accents and backgrounds and casually mentioned language skills. That evening, he told Emma about it over dinner, how a man who cooked food had helped save people by speaking his language, how being different and having unusual knowledge could make you valuable instead of strange. Emma listened with her characteristic intense focus, then asked, "Can I help?" "How would you help?" She considered this seriously. "I could. I could make a chart. Languages and people, colors for different languages. I'm good at organizing." Casper looked at his 7-year-old daughter who struggled with speech but thought in systems and patterns, who was already processing the world in multiple languages, who saw connections that others missed. "You know what? That's a brilliant idea. We'll work on it together." They spent the evening creating a color-coded system for tracking language resources, Emma's methodical mind perfect for the task. She chose purple for Kurdish, blue for Pashto, green for Arabic, and worked with fierce concentration to organize the information Casper provided. By bedtime, they had the skeleton of a database that would eventually change how Ramstein approached linguistic intelligence. And Emma, who'd spent most of her life being told she was behind, fell asleep knowing she contributed something meaningful to her father's important work. Maxim lay awake that night thinking about General Volkov's chain reaction of recognition, how being seen had allowed him to see others, how the value he'd been given was now something he could extend. The work mattered. Emma mattered more. And somehow, impossibly, he was building a life where both could be true. Outside, aircraft continued their endless rotation of missions, carrying people and equipment and the weight of decisions into the dark. But inside a small apartment near the base, a single father and his remarkable daughter were quietly constructing something that would matter in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 6 months into his position, Maxim Casper had become a fixture at Ramstein, though not in any traditional sense. He still worked his disciplined 700 to 1600 schedule, still picked Emma up every afternoon, still maintained the boundaries that kept him present for his daughter. But within those hours, he transformed the intelligence division's linguistic capabilities through a combination of excellent work and unconventional thinking. The network he'd proposed, what they'd started calling the Linguistic Resource Initiative, had grown to include 43 base personnel with language skills ranging from Tagalog to Swahili. There was a Polish maintenance supervisor, a Filipino medical technician, a Nigerian supply clerk, an Indonesian administrative specialist, all people whose backgrounds had been reduced to job descriptions until someone thought to ask what else they knew. They weren't employees of intelligence division. They were consultants who could be called upon when their specific expertise was needed, compensated fairly for their time, and given the satisfaction of knowing their cultural knowledge contributed to something meaningful. The initiative had already prevented 2 intelligence failures and identified 3 emerging threat patterns that conventional analysis had missed. But success brought scrutiny. In his 7th month, Casper found himself summoned to a conference room where he faced a review board consisting of 3 senior intelligence officers from European Command, none of whom worked directly at Ramstein, and none of whom looked particularly impressed by the civilian contractor sitting across from them. Colonel Patricia Hartley, the lead reviewer, was a career intelligence officer with the rigid demeanor of someone who believed protocols existed for good reasons and deviation was suspect by definition. She opened a folder and studied it with an expression that suggested she was reading an indictment. "Mr. Casper, you've created an unofficial network of base personnel who have access to classified intelligence materials. These individuals have not gone through standard vetting procedures, have not completed intelligence training, and have no formal oversight structure. Explain why this doesn't represent a massive security violation." Casper had known this was coming. Akonkau had warned him, and General Volkov had prepared him with talking points. But facing 3 stone-faced colonels, he felt the old civilian contractor vulnerability return, the sense that one wrong answer could end everything he'd built. "Ma'am, with respect, the network members don't have direct access to classified materials. They consult on specific linguistic or cultural questions presented to them in controlled settings. They never see full intercepts, source identities, or operational context. They provide expertise on language, not intelligence." Hartley wasn't satisfied, but they're aware they're contributing to intelligence operations. They could be foreign agents, sympathizers, or simply indiscreet. Your initiative has created a security nightmare. Colonel, with respect, these people live and work on a military base. They're already background checked for base access. They're already trusted with our security in a dozen other ways. We trust the Polish supervisor to maintain fighter aircraft, but not to confirm that a phrase in Polish means what we think it means. Colonel Marcus Chen, the second reviewer, leaned forward. The difference, Mr. Casper, is that maintenance work doesn't involve classified intelligence that could compromise operations or endanger lives. Neither does confirming dialect, Casper countered. We're not asking them to analyze intelligence. We're asking them to provide the same cultural expertise that I provide, just for languages where my knowledge has gaps. And if one of them talks, Hartley pressed, if one of them mentions to a friend that they're consulting on military intelligence, then we handle it the same way we handle any security violation, Casper said. But in 7 months, we haven't had a single incident. These people understand operational security. They're not naive. The third colonel, an older officer named Vincent Morrison who'd been silent until now, spoke quietly. Mr. Casper, I read your file. You embedded with Special Forces for 3 years in Afghanistan. You understand the stakes. So help me understand why you're comfortable with this level of informality in intelligence operations. Casper met Morrison's eyes. Because, sir, I've seen what happens when we ignore valuable intelligence because it doesn't come through official channels. I've watched soldiers die because we didn't understand cultural context that a local could have explained in 30 seconds. I've seen billion-dollar operations fail because nobody thought to ask someone who actually lived in the region what a particular phrase really meant. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. The most dangerous thing in intelligence isn't the information that gets compromised. It's the information we never gather because we're too rigid to recognize where it lives. These network members are resources we're failing to use properly. My initiative just organizes what should have been happening all along. Hartley's expression suggested she wasn't convinced. Your passion is noted, but passion doesn't justify bypassing security protocols. Then change the protocols, Casper said flatly. Build a formal program that does what my initiative does but with official oversight. I'll help design it. But don't shut down something that works, because it doesn't fit the existing bureaucratic structure. The room went silent. A civilian contractor didn't generally tell colonels to change protocols, but Casper was tired of watching good ideas die in administrative quicksand, tired of pretending that the way things had always been done was automatically the best way. Morrison's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. You're aware you're lecturing 3 full colonels about intelligence operations. Yes, sir, and I apologize if I'm out of line. But you asked me to help you understand, and I'm trying to give you an honest answer. Hartley closed the folder with a snap. We'll continue this review. In the meantime, the Linguistic Resource Initiative is suspended pending security assessment. You'll restrict your work to your own direct translations. No more consultations with non-intelligence personnel. Casper felt the pronouncement like a physical blow. Colonel, we have 3 active analyses that depend on network consultations. If you suspend the initiative, we lose critical context on time-sensitive intelligence. Then you'll work faster, Mr. Casper, or Captain Okonkwo will redistribute the work. But until we're satisfied that your network doesn't represent unacceptable risk, it's offline. The meeting ended, and Casper walked out feeling like he'd just lost a battle he'd been winning for months. In the hallway, he found General Volkov waiting, her expression unreadable. They suspended it, he said unnecessarily. I heard. Hartley called me before the meeting to give me a courtesy heads-up that they were shutting down my pet project. Volkov's tone was dry. Come with me. She led him to her office, closed the door, and gestured for him to sit. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. That was well done, Casper stared. Ma'am, they just killed the initiative. They suspended it for review. That's different. And you defended it exactly right. Passionate but rational, challenging them without being insubordinate, forcing them to articulate why it's a problem instead of letting them shut it down based on discomfort with informality. She leaned back in her chair. Morrison is an old friend. He'll tell me later what they're really thinking. Hartley's a by-the-book officer who distrusts anything innovative, but she's also fair. If we give her a formal structure she can approve, she'll support it. Chen is the swing vote, and he responds to data. So what do? Casper asked. We build the formal program they're asking for, Volkov said. We document every security measure, create official training protocols, design oversight structures, and present them with a proposal so thorough they can't reject it without looking obstructionist. She pulled out a notepad. You've got 2 weeks while they conduct their review. I want a complete program proposal. Mission statement, security procedures, vetting process, training requirements, oversight mechanisms, and success metrics. Make it bulletproof. That's a massive amount of work, ma'am. Then you'd better start now, Volkov said. And Casper, don't do it alone. Pull in Okonkwo, pull in Colonel Reeves, pull in anyone who can help. This isn't just about your initiative anymore. This is about changing how the military thinks about linguistic intelligence. She stood, signaling the meeting was over. You picked a fight with the bureaucracy. Now you have to win it properly. Over the next 2 weeks, Casper barely slept. He worked his regular hours, but every evening after Emma was in bed, he returned to his laptop and built the framework for what he started calling the Joint Linguistic Advisory Network, a formal program with clear security protocols, defined roles, vetting procedures adapted from contractor clearance processes, and oversight structures that satisfied military bureaucracy while preserving the flexibility that made the initiative valuable. Okonkwo contributed the intelligence oversight sections. Reeves provided endorsement from operational units that had benefited from the network. Dilshed Ahmed, the Kurdish consultant who'd helped with the convoy analysis, wrote a testimonial about what it meant to refugees to contribute expertise to their adopted country. Emma, in her own way, helped too. She created visual organizational charts that made the program structure comprehensible at a glance, her methodical mind perfect for translating complex procedures into clear graphics. When Casper presented these to Okonkwo, the captain studied them thoughtfully. Your daughter did these. She understands systems better than most adults, Casper said. She sees patterns. These are better than anything our graphics people produce, Okonkwo said. Can I include them in the proposal? She'd be proud to contribute, Casper confirmed. On the 14th day, they delivered a 60-page proposal to the review board, complete with Emma's charts, testimonials from using units, security protocols that satisfied even Hartley's concerns, and data showing that the initiative had improved intelligence quality while maintaining zero security incidents. The review board took 3 days to deliberate. During that time, Casper tried to focus on regular work, but his concentration was shot. He'd invested too much into the initiative, cared too much about proving that unconventional approaches could work, needed too badly to show that the military could adapt and recognize value in unexpected places. On the 3rd day, he was called back to the conference room. Hartley, Chen, and Morrison sat behind the table again, but this time there were other people present. General Volkov, Colonel Reeves, and a 2-star General Casper didn't recognize. Hartley spoke first. Mr. Casper, we've reviewed your proposal for the Joint Linguistic Advisory Network. It's comprehensive. Her tone didn't reveal which way the decision had gone. We have concerns about several aspects, particularly the abbreviated vetting timeline. However, we've also consulted with operational commanders who have benefited from your initiative, and their feedback is uniformly positive. She paused, then continued. More importantly, we recognize that modern intelligence operations require flexibility and innovation. The threats we face don't respect bureaucratic boundaries, and neither should our responses. Chen took over. The proposal is approved with modifications. You'll implement a 3-tier vetting system, add quarterly security audits, and establish a formal training program for network consultants. General Volkov will maintain direct oversight, with monthly reports to European Command Intelligence Directorate. Morrison added, we're also recommending this as a pilot program for other major bases. If it works here, It could be scaled throughout the European theater. The unnamed two-star general spoke for the first time. Additionally, Mr. Casper, we're authorizing a GS-12 promotion and officially designating you as Chief Linguistic Integration Advisor. Your position will be permanent, not provisional. Congratulations. Casper felt the words wash over him like a wave, almost too significant to process. Not just approved, expanded. Not just preserved, promoted. And permanent, meaning Emma would have stability, he would have security, they would have a future that wasn't perpetually contingent on provisional authorities and emergency exceptions. Thank you, sir, he managed. Thank you all. After the meeting, as people filed out, Colonel Morrison approached him quietly. I was in Afghanistan too, Mr. Casper. Different region, different time, but same war. I saw what happens when we don't respect local knowledge, when we think technology can replace cultural understanding. What you're building matters. Don't let bureaucracy grind it down. I'll do my best, sir. Morrison smiled slightly. General Volkov said you were stubborn. I can see why she values that. As Casper left the building, he found Volkov waiting by her vehicle. Bad for a janitor, she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. Thank you, ma'am, for all of it, for seeing something nobody else saw. I saw what was there, Volkov corrected. You did the rest. Now comes the harder part, making this sustainable, building something that lasts beyond any one person. She paused, then added, your daughter's charts were the highlight of the proposal, by the way. Colonel Chen specifically mentioned them. Emma might have a future in intelligence analysis herself someday. If she wants it, Casper said, but whatever she wants, at least she'll have options. She'll grow up knowing that being different doesn't mean being less. That's the real victory, Volkov agreed. Now go tell her about it. She earned this too. That evening, Casper took Emma to her favorite place on base, a hill overlooking the airfield where they could watch aircraft take off against the sunset. He explained in terms she could understand that the work they'd done together had become something official, that her charts were now part of military operations, that her way of seeing patterns had helped. Emma processed this with her characteristic seriousness, then asked, Are you happy, Papa? It was such a direct question, delivered with such simple clarity that Casper felt his throat tighten. Yes, Zvezda, I'm very happy. Are you? She nodded firmly. I like it here. I like my school and my friends and my therapist and watching airplanes and helping you with your work and learning languages. She paused, then added with perfect 7-year-old logic, and I like that people don't think you're just a janitor anymore. Casper laughed, pulling her close. I never minded being a janitor. Honest work is honest work. But you're happier doing this work, Emma observed, because it uses all of your brain. She was right, of course. She usually was, in her own particular way of understanding the world. They sat together as the sun set over Germany, watching aircraft carrying their endless cargo of people and missions into the gathering dark. And Maxim Casper allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd found their place in the world. A place where skills mattered more than credentials, where being different was an asset rather than an obstacle, where a single father and his remarkable daughter could build something meaningful together. The sky blazed orange and gold, then faded to purple, then dark. But the runway lights kept burning, steady and bright, guiding arrivals and departures through the night. And somewhere in the Intelligence Operations Center, translations were being processed, consultations were being coordinated, and the network Casper had built continued its quiet work of keeping people safe through the simple act of understanding what others were really saying. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, sitting with his daughter as stars emerged over the airfield, Maxim Casper was simply grateful. 2 years into his permanent position, Casper had become something he'd never quite intended, a quiet legend within military intelligence circles. His Joint Linguistic Advisory Network had expanded to 7 bases across Europe and was being adapted for implementation in Pacific Command. He trained 3 junior civilian advisors who were now running similar programs at other installations. The network had grown to over 200 consultants across multiple regions, preventing 11 confirmed intelligence failures and contributing to 47 successful operations. But the work that mattered most to him happened in quieter moments, in the small interventions that changed individual lives rather than strategic outcomes. Like the afternoon he'd noticed a young airman from Georgia, the country, not the state, struggling with an intercept involving Georgian separatist communications. The airman, Sophia Nattery, was Air Force intelligence with 3 years in service, competent and hardworking but clearly drowning in this particular assignment. Her supervisor had reassigned it to Casper when it became urgent. Instead of just taking it over, Casper had asked Nattery to walk him through what she'd translated so far. Her Georgian was textbook perfect but missing the cultural subtext, the generational differences in dialect, the way political history shaped linguistic choices in that region. "You learned this in DLI?" he asked. "Yes, sir. 18 months of intensive Georgian." "It's excellent technically," Casper said honestly, "but language school teaches you grammar and vocabulary. It doesn't teach you how grandmothers in Tbilisi talk differently from teenagers in Batumi, or why someone from South Ossetia uses Russian loanwords differently than someone from Ajara." Nattery's frustration was visible. "So I'm missing context I can't learn from a textbook." "No, you're missing context you can learn from people. That's different." He pulled up the network database. "We have 4 Georgian consultants in the network. One is a restaurant owner, one is a former journalist, one is a military dependent who immigrated in 2008, and one is a graduate student studying here. Between them, they represent 3 regions and 2 generations. Let's consult them." Over the next 2 hours, Casper walked Nattery through the process of cultural consultation, not just getting answers but learning to ask the right questions, understanding why regional variations mattered, recognizing the patterns that separated accurate translation from genuine comprehension. By the end, Nattery had completed the intercept analysis successfully and learned more about practical linguistic intelligence than months of classroom work had taught her. "Sir," she said as they finished, "why did you teach me this instead of just doing it yourself?" "Because in 5 years you'll be the one training junior analysts," Casper said. "If I just fix your work, you stay dependent. If I teach you how to think about these problems, you become more valuable than me." The next week, Nattery requested transfer to work directly with Casper's team. Her supervisor approved it, and suddenly Casper found himself mentoring rather than just consulting. It was a role he hadn't sought, but it fit better than expected. Meanwhile, Emma was thriving. Now 9 years old, she'd progressed dramatically in speech therapy while maintaining her remarkable capacity for language acquisition. She spoke 7 languages conversationally and was learning 3 more. Her special education teachers reported that she'd begun helping other students, particularly refugee children struggling with English, using a patient, methodical approach that worked better than conventional instruction. The school had asked if Casper would speak at a faculty development session about teaching multilingual children with developmental differences. He declined twice, uncomfortable with public speaking, before Emma had looked at him seriously and asked, "Why won't you help, Papa? You teach people at work." "That's different, Zvezda." "How?" She'd asked it with genuine curiosity, no judgment, just that relentless logic that characterized her thinking. He didn't have a good answer, so he'd agreed to speak. The presentation was awkward and uncomfortable, but the teachers asked smart questions, and by the end, they developed 3 new approaches for supporting multilingual special needs students on base. A month later, 2 teachers from a different base requested similar consultation. Then 4 more. Within a year, Casper was conducting quarterly workshops on linguistic development and cultural adaptation for military educators throughout the European theater, always bringing Emma's example as the through line. She would sit in back during these presentations, quietly doing homework or drawing, occasionally raising her hand to add a detail her father had forgotten. The educators loved her, this articulate, thoughtful child who'd struggled so much but found her own path forward. "Your daughter," one teacher told Casper after a workshop, "represents exactly what we're trying to achieve. We don't want to make different kids normal. We want to help them become the best version of themselves." Casper had thought about that comment for days. It crystallized something he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. The work wasn't about forcing people into predetermined categories. It was about recognizing and nurturing whatever excellence they already possessed. In his third year, the recognition escalated in ways that made him uncomfortable. European Command nominated him for a Civilian Service Award. Military intelligence journals requested articles about the network methodology. He was asked to brief senior Pentagon officials about integrating cultural advisors into intelligence operations. Each request felt surreal to someone who'd spent years believing his most valuable contribution was mopping floors quietly and staying out of the way. The briefing at the Pentagon was particularly disorienting. Casper stood in a secure conference room facing 24 senior officers and civilian defense officials, explaining how a network of cooks and janitors and mechanics had become critical intelligence infrastructure. He showed Emma's organizational charts, now refined and professionally formatted but still fundamentally her work. He walked through case studies where cultural context had prevented disaster, and he argued, as directly as he dared, that the military needed to fundamentally rethink how it identified and utilized human capital. We spend millions training people in languages they'll use for a few years before rotating to different specialties, he said. Meanwhile, we employ thousands of people with native linguistic and cultural expertise, and we use them to clean buildings and serve food. That's not just wasteful, it's strategically short-sighted. A rear admiral in the back raised his hand. You're suggesting we should be recruiting janitors into intelligence operations. I'm suggesting we should recognize that job titles don't define capability, Casper corrected. Some janitors have skills that exceed trained specialists. Some trained specialists would be better in support roles. We should be matching people to work based on what they can actually do, not what their resume says they should do. The admiral smiled slightly. You were a janitor. Yes, sir, and I was a terrible janitor. I'm much better at this. The room laughed and the tension broke. The briefing ended with tentative approval to expand the network pilot program to 3 additional combatant commands. It wasn't the dramatic transformation Casper had argued for, but it was movement, progress, acknowledgement that maybe the unconventional approach had merit. On the flight back to Germany, Casper felt exhausted and oddly melancholic. The work was succeeding beyond anything he'd imagined. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought attention, and attention meant less time doing the work itself and more time explaining or defending or promoting it. He missed the quiet focus of translation, the puzzle-solving satisfaction of parsing difficult intercepts. He missed afternoon pickups with Emma where they'd stop for ice cream and practice, whichever language she was currently obsessed with. When he finally returned to Ramstein, Emma ran to him at the childcare facility with an enthusiasm that made his heart simultaneously full and guilty. Papa, I learned a new phrase in Portuguese. Want to hear? Always Zvezda. As they drove home, Emma chattered about her week, about friends in school and a science project on satellites. Then, with the conversational pivot that children somehow mastered, she asked, Are you famous now? What? No. Why would you think that? Maria's mom said you're famous. She saw an article about your program, Casper sighed. I'm not famous, I'm just known for doing something that works. That's different. Do you like it? He considered the question seriously, giving Emma the honest answer she deserved. I like that the work matters. I like that we're helping people and making operations better. But I liked it more when it was just us doing the work quietly. Being known for it feels strange. Like when people at school make a big deal about my languages, Emma asked. Kind of like that, Casper agreed. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I tell them I just like learning. It's not special, it's just what I like. And what do they say? Some people understand. Some people think I'm showing off. But Papa, you taught me that it doesn't matter what other people think as long as you know why you're doing something. Casper pulled into their apartment complex and turned to face his daughter. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise, Emma said with perfect 9-year-old seriousness. You just notice it more now. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Casper sat on their balcony and thought about trajectory and purpose and the strange mathematics of success. He'd wanted to do meaningful work and support his daughter. He'd achieved both. But somewhere in the achievement, the work had grown beyond his control, had become something larger and more public than he'd ever wanted. His phone buzzed with a message from General Volkov. Pentagon briefing feedback is excellent. SecDef's office wants quarterly updates on network expansion. You're changing how DoD thinks about human capital. Well done. KV, he should feel proud. He did feel proud, but he also felt the familiar tug of wanting something simpler, more direct, less performative. Another message arrived, this one from Sophia Nattery, his Georgian mentee. Sir, got my first complex solo intercept today. Used the network consultation process you taught me. Worked perfectly. Thank you for teaching me to think instead of just translate. SN, that message mattered more than Pentagon approval. That was the work he valued, the direct transfer of knowledge, the individual transformation, the chain reaction of competence spreading through deliberate mentorship. A third message, unexpected. Dilshed Ahmed, the Kurdish consultant who'd been his first network recruit. Mr. Casper, my son asked me today what I do at work. I told him I help the military understand people better, and I could see him think differently about me. Thank you for that. D.A. Casper read the message 3 times, feeling something settle in his chest. This was why it mattered, not the accolades or the expansion or the Pentagon briefings. The work mattered because it gave people like Ahmed the chance to be seen for what they actually were. It gave people like Sophia Nattery the tools to become excellent. It gave children like Emma examples of how being different could be valuable. He typed responses to all 3 messages, then set down his phone and looked up at the German sky. Stars were visible through the light pollution, the same stars that were visible over Afghanistan, over Montana, over Budapest where Emma's mother had been born, over every place that had shaped the unlikely path that led to this moment. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Networks would expand, procedures would be refined, success would bring new demands. But tonight, sitting alone on a balcony in a small apartment near a military base, Maxim Casper allowed himself to simply be grateful that someone had looked past the maintenance uniform and seen what was underneath, and that he'd been given the chance to do the same for others. Inside, Emma slept peacefully, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, dreaming whatever dreams came to brilliant children who'd learned that the world's initial judgments could be changed through patience, competence, and the quiet accumulation of excellence. And that, Casper reflected, was the lesson worth teaching. Not that recognition was guaranteed or that fairness was automatic, but that sometimes, just sometimes, the right person noticed at the right moment, and doors opened that had seemed permanently locked. His job now was to be that person for others, to notice and open doors, to build the kind of organization where capability mattered more than credential, where janitors could become advisors and advisors could remember they'd once been overlooked too. The work was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Maxim Casper felt like he'd found not just a job, but a calling, and that made all the difference. By his 5th year at Ramstein, Casper had become an institution, though he still bristled at the recognition. The Joint Linguistic Advisory Network had expanded to 16 bases across 4 combatant commands, with over 500 consultants providing cultural and linguistic expertise to operations worldwide. The program had been formally integrated into Defense Intelligence Agency procedures and was being taught as a case study at the National Defense University. Emma, now 11, had developed into something extraordinary. Her speech had caught up almost entirely, the delays so minimal that strangers no longer noticed them. She spoke 9 languages fluently and could read in 12 different writing systems. More remarkably, she developed her own methodology for teaching languages to other children with developmental differences, a system that combined visual organization, pattern recognition, and cultural storytelling in ways that conventional pedagogy hadn't considered. A researcher from Georgetown's linguistics department had approached Casper about studying Emma's learning process, but he'd politely declined. Emma wasn't a research subject. She was his daughter, and whatever genius she possessed would develop on her own terms, not under academic scrutiny. Still, her reputation grew. Teachers referred struggling students to her. Parents of special needs children asked Casper for advice. Emma took it all with equanimity, helping when she could, setting boundaries when she needed to, displaying an emotional intelligence that constantly surprised him. "Papa," she'd said one evening when he tried to shield her from yet another request for help, "if I can help people, why shouldn't I? You taught me that skills are meant to be used." He couldn't argue with his own lessons reflected back at him, but he watched carefully to make sure the helping didn't become burden, that his remarkable daughter didn't sacrifice her childhood to other people's expectations. Then came the incident that would test everything they'd built. In his fifth autumn at Ramstein, intelligence intercepted communications suggesting a planned attack against a military school in Stuttgart, a facility that served children of American service members, including Emma's school friend Marcus, whose father was stationed there. The intercept was in a North African Arabic dialect mixed with Berber and French, dense with cultural references and coded language that made definitive translation nearly impossible. 3 translators had attempted it. All reached different conclusions about whether the threat was imminent, aspirational, or possibly misinterpreted civilian conversation about something entirely different. The ambiguity was paralyzing. Overreact and you create panic, waste resources, potentially compromise intelligence sources. Underreact and children die. Captain Okonkwo, now Major Okonkwo after her own promotion, brought the intercept to Casper at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. Her expression told him everything before she spoke. "We need your best work," she said simply. "Lives depend on getting this exactly right." Casper took the file into a secure analysis room and spent 6 hours with the intercept, listening repeatedly, mapping dialect variations, consulting with 3 network members who had expertise in North African linguistic patterns. The more he analyzed, the more certain he became that this wasn't a simple translation problem. It was a cultural comprehension problem. The speakers were discussing something serious, potentially violent, but the framework wasn't militant, it was tribal. They were talking about justice and honor in response to grievance, using martial language but within a context that suggested clan dynamics rather than terrorism. The threat wasn't against the school itself. It was against a specific teacher at the school, a man named Hassan Khalid who'd apparently been involved in a tribal dispute in Morocco before immigrating to Germany, a dispute that had resulted in deaths and property destruction. Cousins of the victims had tracked him to Stuttgart and were discussing confronting him, using language aggressive enough to be interpreted as planning an attack. But the actual content suggested they wanted public confrontation and legal action, not violence. They were angry, not operational. The distinction mattered enormously. Treating this as a terrorist threat would trigger lockdowns, evacuations, potentially international incident. Treating it as a civil dispute that needed mediation would lead to an entirely different response. Casper wrote up his analysis, flagged the uncertainty clearly, and recommended further investigation of Hassan Khalid's background and current monitoring of the speakers before taking operational action. Major Okonkwo read his assessment, then looked up sharply. "You're saying we shouldn't evacuate the school." "I'm saying we should investigate before we escalate," Casper corrected. "If I'm right, evacuating creates exactly the public scene these men want. Exposure of Khalid's past, humiliation, vindication of their grievance. If I'm wrong and we don't evacuate." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what that meant. Okonkwo called in Colonel Morrison, who'd been promoted to oversee all intelligence operations for European Command. He read Casper's analysis twice, asked pointed questions, then made the call Casper had been dreading. "We're bringing in Hassan Khalid for questioning. If your assessment is correct, we'll handle this as civil dispute. If you're wrong," Morrison's expression was grim. "If you're wrong, Casper, children die. Are you confident enough in your analysis to accept that responsibility?" Casper felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like physical pressure. This was different from previous analyses. Those had been important, but this was Emma's friend, children he knew, a wrong call that would haunt him forever. I'm confident in my methodology, sir. I'm confident in the cultural context, but I can't guarantee outcome. Nobody can. Morrison nodded slowly. That's an honest answer. We'll proceed with your recommendation. Over the next 18 hours, military police brought Hassan Khalid in for questioning. His background check revealed exactly what Casper had suspected. A merchant from Marrakesh who'd been peripherally involved in a land dispute that turned violent, had fled to Europe to escape retribution, and had been living quietly in Germany for 6 years teaching mathematics to military children. The men in the intercept were located and interviewed. They admitted planning to confront Khalid publicly, to demand he answer for his role in their cousins' deaths, to force acknowledgement and potentially pursue legal action. They had no weapons, no operational plan beyond showing up at the school with signs and witnesses. It was grief and anger seeking justice through exposure, not terrorism seeking casualties. The school never locked down. Children never evacuated. Marcus continued playing with Emma, unaware how close he'd come to being part of an international incident. And Hassan Khalid, after extensive investigation and mediation, agreed to return to Morocco to face a traditional tribal council, with protection guarantees that allowed him to answer grievances without violence. Crisis averted through accurate cultural comprehension, but the experience left Casper shaken in ways previous successes hadn't. The responsibility of being right, of accepting the consequences if he was wrong, felt different when it involved children he knew, a school his daughter attended, friends who would die if his assessment was incorrect. That evening, he told Emma an edited version of what had happened, that her friend Marcus's school had been worried about a threat, that Papa's work had helped figure out it wasn't as dangerous as it seemed. Emma listened with her characteristic focus, then asked, "Were you scared you might be wrong?" "Yes," Casper admitted, "very scared. But you did the work anyway." "Yes. That's brave, Papa," he smiled tiredly. "That's job requirement, Zvezda, being scared and doing it anyway." Emma considered this seriously. "Is that what you want me to learn, to do important things even when I'm scared? I want you to learn that being scared of responsibility doesn't excuse you from responsibility. When you have skills people need, you use them, even when it's hard." She nodded slowly, processing. Then she said, "I think I'm going to be scared a lot when I grow up." "Probably," Casper agreed. "But you'll do the important things anyway, because that's who you are." 2 weeks later, General Volkov summoned Casper to her office. She'd been promoted to 3 stars and now oversaw all intelligence operations for European theater, but she'd maintained personal oversight of Casper's program despite the broader responsibilities. "Sit down," she said without preamble. "We need to discuss your future." Casper felt a twist of apprehension. "Ma'am, you've built something remarkable. The network functions better than anyone predicted. You've trained a team that can run it without you. You've proven that unconventional approaches can work in institutional settings." She paused. "So now we have a decision to make about what comes next." "I don't understand, ma'am." "Maxim," she said, using his first name for maybe the 3rd time in 5 years. "You've spent 5 years building infrastructure. You're good at it. But I've watched you over the past year, and I think you're starting to burn out on administration and politics. Am I wrong?" He couldn't lie to her. "No, ma'am, you're not wrong." "What do you want?" Volkov asked directly. "If you could design your own position, what would it look like?" Casper had never articulated it, but the answer came immediately. "I want a mentor. I want to teach people how to think about linguistic intelligence the way I think about it. I want to develop capability in others instead of just processing intercepts myself." "That's what I thought." Volkov pulled out a file. "I'm creating a new position, Senior Advisor for Linguistic Intelligence Development. You'll train analysts, consult on complex cases, and develop curriculum for integrating cultural comprehension into intelligence operations. Less administration, more direct impact." "Interested?" "Very interested, ma'am." "Good. Because I'm also assigning you a team of 6 analysts who will become the core instructors for this methodology. You'll teach them, they'll teach others, and we'll scale up capability across the entire enterprise." She smiled slightly. You're going to create a generation of analysts who think like you. That's your next mission. Casper felt something shift inside him, the sense of finding a role that fit even better than the previous one. When do I start? Next month. Use the time to transition the network administration to your deputy. Then we begin the real work. As Casper left her office, he realized that Volkov had done it again, seen what he needed before he'd fully recognized it himself, created space for him to evolve rather than stagnate. He thought about General Washington, the friend she'd mentioned years ago who died choosing work over presents. He thought about Emma, who'd asked if he'd be scared a lot as he grew up. He thought about Hassan Khalid, whose past had caught up to him in a military school parking lot in Germany. And he thought about what it meant to spend your life doing work that mattered while remaining present for the people who mattered more. The balance was delicate, probably impossible to sustain perfectly. But with the right support, with clear boundaries, with institutional respect for the fact that people were more than their job descriptions, maybe it was possible to build something sustainable. That evening, he told Emma about the new position, about how he'd be teaching instead of just analyzing. She listened, then said, "Like I teach other kids languages, exactly like that. Will you be happier?" "I think so, Zvezda." "Yes." Emma smiled. "Good. Because when you're happy, you teach me better Russian pronunciations." He laughed, pulling her close. "Your Russian pronunciation is already better than mine." "I know," she said with cheerful confidence, "but you still help me get better." And that, Casper reflected, was the essence of what he'd been given and what he hoped to pass forward. Not just knowledge or technique or methodology, but the fundamental belief that people could always grow beyond whatever limitations others had assigned them, that excellence could be taught and learned and multiplied through deliberate investment in human potential. Outside, the autumn sun was setting over the German countryside, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Aircraft continued their endless cycles, missions proceeding, the vast machinery of military operations grinding forward regardless of individual stories. But within that machinery, small transformations were occurring, janitors becoming advisors, children learning 9 languages, networks forming that valued capability over credential, and those transformations, accumulated over time, would change the nature of the machine itself. Tomorrow, the new work would begin. Tonight, Maxim Casper was simply a father making dinner with his daughter, practicing Russian pronunciation, and feeling grateful that someone had once knocked on a conference room door at 3 in the morning and asked a question that changed everything. The work was just beginning, but it was the right work, done for the right reasons, and that made all the difference.